My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco. I am a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of domination, oppression, war, and empire. And one of these things that we do as part of our projects is to have conversations with different social change agents, theorists, scholars about what does it mean to imagine a future free of oppression, domination, war, and empire, and how can we go about building social movements and social power to achieve those kinds of goals. My guest today is someone who has been thinking a lot about philosophy at the margins of the center. And what I mean by that is, I was thinking very recently about the work of the Argentinian philosopher Enrique Dussel in his Philosophy of Liberation. It's a work from the late 1970s, early 1980s. And he was writing at this time, during the time of the Dirty War in Argentina, to think about the ways in which we can think about liberation, not just in a social political sense, but also in an ideological sense. The ways in which we can free our minds from oppressive structures that are placed in there by power to get us to think in certain ways to perpetuate those structures of power. And so he talks about, Dussel does, about thinking at the margins of the center, not only geographically, but also philosophically. And by philosophically, I think about Nelson Maldonado Torres, who talks about thinking about the coloniality of power, the way that colonial powers, European powers in the past, structured the ways of thinking of people in colonial societies, structuring their ways of thinking and desiring in order to perpetuate the social, political, and economic structures of colonial power. And so there's a way of thinking of colonialism as affecting our minds and the ways in which we desire and the ways in which we think. My guest today is someone who has been thinking about the coloniality of power, the coloniality of philosophy for a very long time. She is Manuela Alejandra Gomez. She's a philosophy professor at El Paso Community College. She has over 15 years of teaching experience, both in the United States and in Mexico. And she specializes in philosophical pedagogy, ethics, feminism, Latin American, and Latinx philosophy. She's also an award-winning journalist who's worked both in Mexico and in the United States. And I've invited her here to think a little bit about what does it mean to practice philosophy along and within the border, both geographically and ideologically. Manuela, thank you for being here.
I'm super excited to be here. Thank you. I think this is a magnificent project and I'm super glad to be a part of it.
Well, we're very grateful that you're here to speak with us. I'm asking you to be here partly because there's sort of a holiday coming up in November that many people don't know about, but the UN has designated November 19th as World Philosophy Day. And in the United States, this doesn't often get very much celebration or mention even, but in other places around the world, there's a lot of notice about this in universities and places of higher education. And so when I was thinking about what to do for World Philosophy Day, I was trying to think about what does it mean to do philosophy in the world today? And I've known you for many years and known about your work. And thinking about the kinds of recognition that you're now getting for some of the projects that you're doing made me think that you would be an appropriate person to think about, like, what are the contours of contemporary philosophy today? And particularly, you're thinking about philosophy not just as an academic practice, but as something that informs social practice. And so that's why I wanted to come and have you speak a little bit today with us. Because I know that you grew up and you now teach philosophy along the US-Mexico border, and you've taught both in the United States and in Mexico. I was wondering if you could begin by telling us a little bit about what the border means to you, because you've grown up in what Gloria Anzaldúa calls the borderlands. You inhabit that space, and then you have lived in both places, worked in both places, and as a journalist, you've really spent a lot of time studying both places. Can you tell us a little bit about what the borderlands mean to you as a person?
Absolutely. I think I have a philosophical answer and then a personal answer that's going to give more insight into what I mean. So, For me, the border represents this complex hybridity of constant navigation and, like Ansaldúa would say, in-betweenness. But it's also this ultimate space for possibilities. I feel like we're in an axis of constant inclusion and exclusion. We have the best and worst of both worlds simultaneously. So people like myself that have been here, we find that our identities are contested on both sides. And there's a lot of unique philosophical phenomena that happens precisely because of this. So to add on to that, like many people in the US-Mexico border, I was born in El Paso, Texas, but I was raised in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Neither of my parents spoke a word of English, so I learned it in school as a second language. Both of my parents were journalists. My mother, Linda Bejarano, she was very courageous and outspoken. When I was 6 years old, she was 6 months pregnant at the time. She was murdered by a Mexican drug cartel for a story that she published, along with my grandmother, my father's best friend, and my father was the only one who survived the attack. So he dedicated his entire life to instilling the value of education in my sister and I. So I have that very ingrained in me, that education is the only way to overcome any sort of oppression that I might encounter. There's a statue of my mother in Tijuana, another border city, that celebrates her life at the Plaza de la Libertad de Expresión. So as a young girl, I was exposed to a lot of philosophical questions, like where is my mother? What is justice? What is death? And I feel like I naturally became philosophical at a young age without necessarily having studied philosophical theory or reading philosophy books. I remember one year my father decided that we should move to the US. We tried that for a year and my father couldn't adapt to that. So it was a cultural shock. We moved back to Mexico, but I had to grow up being escorted by bodyguards for my own safety. And on the weekends, my father would take my sister and I across the bridge from Juarez to El Paso for us to learn English on the weekends, you know? So I studied in Mexico up until I was in high school. And that's where I took my first formal philosophy class. And that's one of the cool aspects of education in Mexico, that it's part of the core curriculum. So as a teenager, you have to study logic, you have to study philosophy. And I remember that for me, that felt like the most natural space. It was very welcoming. It had all the questions that I had thought of for many years. That's when my father gave me my first philosophy book ever by Jose Ingenieros, this Latin American philosopher, and the book was El Hombre Mediocre, The Mediocre Man. And I really fell in love with it. I was in high school at the peak of the femicides in Juarez, when hundreds of women were disappearing daily. They were being raped and killed, and they still are, but back then it was part of the international news. So I remember being terrified walking home from school. We were forced to wear a uniform, plaid skirt, white shirt. I felt very uncomfortable. And I remember that studying philosophy slowly gave me the confidence to speak up. And something as simple as running for class president and then slowly getting away with girls also wearing gray pants, just like the boys for school. Like these little acts that made me realize that philosophy wasn't trapped in a book. I really felt that this is something that could become a tool for empowerment. So later I moved to the US, specifically for college to New Mexico. And that's where I decided to double major in journalism and philosophy. I wanted to honor my mother's legacy and study journalism, but I also was in love with philosophy and I wanted to learn more. I quickly realized that philosophy in English was way harder than reading philosophy in Spanish. So I almost failed my first philosophy class. And I remember it was my father's motivation of telling me, you can do both. You can do journalism and philosophy, both majors that require that you're eloquent to a certain extent, even if it wasn't my own language at the time. So I was very fortunate to have internships in New York and Miami. I won a national scholarship for El Show de Cristina in Univision in Miami. So I was exposed to all parts of journalism. And I remember, even though I had several journalism opportunities waiting for me when I graduated, that I really wanted to study philosophy because I wasn't satisfied. I wanted to learn more. And in my research, I found that I could study Latin American philosophy at Texas A&M University. So I was super fortunate to be under the mentorship of Dr. Gregory Papas, Dr. John McDermott, a philosophical legend that took me under his wing and made sure that I was able to go to a university like Texas A&M and actually teach him about Latin American philosophy. When I defended my thesis, I'll never forget that he made me feel very empowered by saying, this is the day that every teacher looks forward to, the day when a student teaches their own teacher. And he really valued what I brought to this department. So he thanked me for my work. And then I found out that I was the first Mexican American to ever graduate with a degree in philosophy. And we're talking about a school that was established in 1876. So that made me realize that it was a serious responsibility, that now it was official that there aren't very many Mexican American philosophers, much less women that are trying to seek justice through philosophy and through journalism. And I've obviously experienced racism and discrimination, but I've also discovered the power of teaching and the power of empathy. So I've been teaching college philosophy for over 15 years, and we have these unique border issues here, of contested identities, of narco violence, of femicides, of racism. Just last year, we had this man drive from out of town and kill 23 people because of his racial ideologies. So my intellectual work is 100% shaped by my lived experience. It's 100% shaped by the fact that I'm in the border. And that's why my focus is on philosophical pedagogy, ethics, feminism, Latin American philosophy, but also making sure that philosophy doesn't stay in a book, that philosophy has to be out in the community, and it has to have some sort of real consequence that we can see change in.
No, I think that's, thank you for that very powerful story. I wanted to ask you just a follow up on some of that. You spoke a little bit about, for you, that philosophy, you saw philosophy as a means of your own empowerment early on. Could you speak about what that was for you? Like, what did you see in the practice and the study of philosophy that made you feel like this was something that could speak to you to help you navigate your world better?
I think that finding specific fields like feminism that empower you specifically because you realize, okay, these are the layers of my oppression. Just understanding that, you obviously feel it without having any sort of intellectual understanding of it, but just having the tools to call it out, just being able to identify logical fallacies in everyday interactions, knowing that you're not easily manipulated by other people because you say, wait a minute, that's a logical fallacy. Finding the power of existentialism and using it as a tool to be introspective and be able to mold yourself as you're creating who you are. I feel like it's a buffet of options that philosophy gives you, and it could only enhance who you are. So for me, I'm still discovering those options, but growing up, I feel like instead of making me feel a victim of my circumstances, it made me empowered in the sense that I could change it and I could mold myself differently.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, it's specifically thinking about that in terms of actual molding and changing circumstances. I want to speak about the activist work that you do. So you're not only just thinking and writing and teaching about life in these kinds of general, abstract, existential terms, but you, through the philosophy club at El Paso Community College, are involved in changing social circumstances, transforming people's lives in various ways. And you've gotten, you know, a lot of recognition recently about the work that you do. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the work you do with the Philosophy Club at EPCC. So could you describe the kinds of projects that your group has gotten involved with and what sort of recognitions that you've gotten for the work that you're doing with students along the border?
Yes. So when we think about philosophers, we automatically think of white European men, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. We rarely ever think of a group of brown students from the border being philosophers and actually creating change. And I'm very proud of the fact that this is what we've had as a result of the last 8 years. I created the Philosophy Club 8 years ago. It increasingly and inevitably has transformed into more than just philosophical discussions every 2 weeks. That's how we started, analyzing different philosophical topics. But slowly we found that we had to get into the community because a lot of the topics that we were discussing were happening right in front of us. So for instance, the topic of ethics of immigration. Before it was in the mainstream news, before people knew about family separation, we knew that in our own community, we had migrant shelters and we had a lot of children that were separated from their families, feeling vulnerable in these shelters. And I felt hypocritical being in a room just discussing this when we could be doing something about it. And it's not so easy to say, I'm just going to show up and do something because there's a lot of layers of security and not anybody can just show up. So slowly through the years, we approached some of the shelters and we asked if it was okay for us to fundraise and bring Christmas gifts to all the kids. And it started as something simple, like let's find ways so that we can buy all the kids some gifts. And keep in mind, my students, they're working full time. They don't have the money to simply just buy the gifts themselves. So we had to find creative ways in which, how are we going to make money? So that turned into a fun activity, you know, going to the farmers markets on the weekends and, you know, telling people about our project and seeing if they want to fundraise with us or donations or students selling donuts and chocolate. And through the years, we were able to demonstrate that we meant what we were doing. So we got security clearance for us to actually deliver the gifts ourselves. And a couple of years ago, I think that has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life and perhaps one of the most important teaching moments for me when we were able to interact with over 100 of these kids from Latin America. We gave them their gifts. We talked to them a little bit about philosophy. They had no idea what it was. So it was very interesting for us to try to explain what is the club about. And before we left, one of the kids borrowed the microphone from one of the supervisors. And he told us, thank you for making me feel human. Thank you for making us feel human. And several of my students, they broke down because we were not expecting that to be the response. The kids sent 100 letters. In fact, I have one of them, little cards that they made. And it's really lengthy letters where they're saying they're thanking God because they feel so happy that there's humans like us that would think of them and that now their life is so full of joy. And you're thinking that was nothing to me. Like it was a soccer ball. It was a doll, you know? So I think that was the moment when the club realized the potential, because for us, that was like the pre and the post of the club. Just that very powerful experience led us to understand that there's a lot we could do other than just stay in our elitist academic bubble and talk about the ethics of immigration, as opposed to being there and being human, and at the same time it being a super philosophical experience. So we've been doing that for several years. During this pandemic, another big project that we participated in was we made over 2,500 reusable face masks for our community, because we were all meeting through Zoom and we were thinking, well, we can't really do much. And again, students started saying, who are going to be the most vulnerable? It's going to be the migrants and it's going to be the homeless. And the priorities right now for the medical personnel, and it should be, but maybe it's our ethical duty to focus on those communities. So that's how it began. It began slowly with my students Googling, how do you sew, borrowing the machines from their grandmas, finding out if we could uh, get some patterns from the internet. And it grew until we had over 2,000 of these. We delivered them. We partnered up with the Hope Border Institute, who told us specifically which are going to be the shelters that don't have as many masks. My students have spoken to City Council recently during this pandemic on behalf of the club to make sure that migrant families in our community were also receiving the benefits from the CARES Act. And we all put together this philosophical speech that was talking about the ethics of caring for others. Every Valentine's Day, we have this activity called Spread the Love. And that came about when we saw the power of the little cards that we got from the kids. Like a little piece of paper can be so powerful. So we had this conversation about platonic love, and students started saying it shouldn't just be romantic. Like, what else could we do to disrupt this notion that you need a date on Valentine's? And they said, well, let's go take cards and chocolate to the homeless shelter. And we've been doing that for several years. And it turns out to be a very fun activity because students feel like they don't have to have the pressure of it has to be romantic and you have to perform love a specific way. It's just like a fun thing to do. We've been having a lot of virtual lecture series where we discuss philosophy, or we'll give a philosophical lecture on a specific philosopher, and then students will ask questions afterwards. The most recent we had was about the documentary Las Tres Muertes de Marisela Escobedo, the Three Deaths of Marisela Escobedo. It's a Netflix documentary that came out a couple of weeks ago. And just like with everything, it was a matter of going for it. My students said it was a super philosophical documentary, and it talked about the femicides in Juarez and our border community. So I reached out to the director and I told him about the club, and he said he'd be more than happy to talk to us. And then one of my students said, I know the son of Maricel Escobedo. Do you think we should approach him? And I did. And he said, I'd be more than happy to talk about my experience. So we had a conversation with the director, the son, and it was believe it or not, a very uplifting conversation that was about hope. It was about resilience. It was about moving forward. And a lot of people might say, well, how is that philosophical? And to me, the answer is, how is it not? There's change that comes afterwards. There's people that are now creating awareness, and that's how I see philosophy. We need to practice it. And these are some of the activities. We have a lot more community service involvement, but I think during this pandemic, we've gotten very creative, and I think these have been some of the highlights.
You've also received some recognition from the American Philosophical Association, right, too? So you've been getting professional recognition nationwide about the work that you do. Can you say anything about that? What does it feel like to sort of have like the premier association for philosophers in the United States recognize the kind of work that you're doing with your students?
I think it's wonderful. I think it's amazing. I think it also speaks to the fact that even mainstream philosophy is in desperate need of this type of philosophical pedagogy. This is no longer the alternative way. I think slowly we're working towards, we need to have philosophy in action, and we need to be very aware that we're not just philosophers, we're educators, and we're creating philosophers, even if they don't major in philosophy. This is something that I truly believe, that even with one class that you take, a philosophy class, you'll have sufficient tools. Ideally, all my students would become philosophers, but to me, philosopher is not with a PhD in philosophy. It's somebody that now says, I need to be more tolerant, more respectful, have more empathy, feel more, you know? So the APA recognized my work, and I think that was wonderful. We've had international news cover some of these events, and I think that's very interesting because they're so shocked that students would go and do these sort of things, not for a grade, but because they want to.
Mm.
But I see it as that's a great opportunity because it's not exclusive of the border. This is something that many young people want to be doing. It's just a matter of us finding a way to show them how, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So we've had several international articles, both in the US and Mexico. We received several awards. We were named community champions by the local news. So they featured us as the champions for all of our community service. And obviously, none of this is for an award. I
Mm.
feel like just my students participating is the award itself. This is beyond what I would expect, and I'm super grateful for it. But I'm just very happy that we're expanding our parameters of philosophy, and I think that's what I'm committed to, challenging this very limited definition of what philosophy is, what a philosopher does, and what the outcome should be. I feel like if we focused on creating activists more than just scholars, we would have a different world. And we could have both, but if we're only telling students it's a matter of just publishing papers that a couple of people will read and presenting at conferences that a couple of people will show up, we've seen that for decades. That hasn't really brought about major change.
Yeah.
But I feel like if we organize students to be a lot more involved in their communities, that can give us a little bit more hope.
Yeah, so that makes sense. So, I have a couple of questions to sort of follow up on different aspects of what you're talking about. So let me begin with the first part of this is, how do you think that this kind of practical work helps your students to philosophize better? So part of it, yeah, I think you've answered in some ways. You think that this kind of embodied work with real people helps them to develop different kinds of, I don't know, we might call them intellectual virtues, tolerance, care in certain kinds of ways. But you were saying that you think that this gives them a different kind of dimension to doing philosophy in a way. And so I was wondering, how do you think that this kind of experience helps students, young people, to engage in philosophizing itself?
So we need to look at the fact that these Mexican American students on the US-Mexico border, they're already unique in a sense that they live in a transnational space. So a lot of my students cross a physical bridge every day back and forth. So they often navigate these very unique experiences, and they manifest different parts of their identities, and they have unique challenges. And I'm not talking just in terms of nationality and proving who you are at the border, but in terms of language, in terms of social class. There's like a lot of layers. And I feel like philosophy gives them that safe space of, oh, okay, it makes sense that there would be this realm that helps me make sense of who I am, that I'm not this anomaly and that I don't really fit in. I feel like philosophy gives them that tool for them to gain the confidence to be just as they are. I feel like they also benefit because they're seeing that they can have agency in creating actions themselves. So I have students that graduate and then they'll email me, I'm involved with this bigger project, and I thought of when we did this back in the day. So I feel like it gives them a blueprint, a sort of pathway for them to create other types of activity involved, like community involvement activities that would have some sort of change. Ultimately, I think they're becoming activists, and I feel like philosophy is giving them the same tools that it gave me, because I see myself reflected in them. I've experienced a lot of what they've experienced, and I think that's part of the key to the success of the club, that I'm not this outsider dictating to them, that they see that they themselves can also be a philosopher and pursue whatever paths that they want. So I see them benefiting from philosophy in a very practical way, in just very real changes like confidence. They become more eloquent, they speak up, they feel comfortable just speaking in English and then in Spanish, and then realizing, well, yeah, we're in the border, you know? So I see them having a lot of advantages because of it.
Well, so this raises some questions. And actually, this is about, I guess, about also about your experience too, because you know, as you talked about how you came to philosophy, um, it was what was you mentioned before that something that was really important to you was your father introducing you to Jose Ingenieros.
Mhm.
So here's a question, and this sort of ties back to what I was talking about with Enrique Dussel and Nelson Maldonado Torres. There's been a movement in many intellectual circles, many sort of philosophical circles, talking about decolonial philosophy, or sort of decolonizing philosophy. Many folks are talking about that. The way in which we talk about philosophy, the way in which we teach philosophy, is part of this coloniality of power, that perhaps philosophy is too Eurocentric, that the way that we teach the history of philosophy emphasizes the dead white men, and that some folks, you know, go to the extent of saying that maybe philosophy isn't useful, for instance, for students of color. Now, you have a different kind of experience with this. You're sort of saying that philosophy for you was important, and you think that philosophy is important for the students that you work with, which are predominantly you know, Mexican and Mexican-American students. I wonder, right, for you, it was a Latin American philosopher who's not typically someone who's taught in philosophy canon, right? It was this was a special sort of thing, and then you had to go and seek a very special program to be able to do the kind of philosophical development that you did at Texas A&M with McDermott and with Papas. And you know, you are part now of this generation of scholars that have come up who have had resources to be able to think of yourselves as Latin American philosophers and Latinx philosophers in some way. So I'm wondering, you know, how would you talk about whether or not philosophy is a kind of tool that can be useful for empowering students of color? Because there's some people that are suspicious of philosophy in this way, that say that it represents instead a Eurocentric point of view, that maybe it's not useful for the kinds of students that you work with. How would you respond to those kinds of perspectives?
I think it's interesting that you quote Dussel, because I've had the privilege of talking to him about this. I remember when I first met him, I told him my life story. And then he said, ah, it makes sense. You've suffered. You're a philosopher. You've suffered. And to me, that's very powerful, because I feel like anybody who has suffered has to become philosophical. I feel like philosophy is a way out of that same oppression. So I feel like absolutely. Oppression has many intersecting layers. And in these intersections, we find a lot of similarities and needs in what we need. And many students of color, not just in the border, they need role models that they can look up to and say, okay, I can do that too. And many of them lack confidence, and they lack self-advocacy, and they lack healing. And I feel like philosophy, we rarely see it as a tool for healing. And it arms you much more than just with confidence, but with the right tools for you to challenge and stand up and no longer permit certain things. So philosophy is for the oppressed. We've been fooled into thinking that other people that come from privileged backgrounds can tell us the way, but we have more of the experience on how to do this and how to have the empathy to help others. So I don't see it being too Eurocentric. Now, I will say this, I've done a lot of research in terms of the artifacts that we're bringing into our philosophy classrooms. Our textbooks are absolutely Eurocentric. We're not teaching enough diverse multicultural voices for our students to relate. So that is an issue. But if we do it right, there's great power behind it. If you introduce students to these alternative voices that we call, or these thinkers, which I hate that label because they're just as philosophical as anybody else, right? So you have Freire and Ansaldúa being labeled as these thinkers, but if you bring them into your class, because we have the authority to do so, and say, let's look at this philosopher, then students will say, that's me. I see myself reflected in the curriculum. I want to do this. But obviously, if you're just going to bore students with Hegel and Descartes, and they see it as something historical and it doesn't apply to their lived experience, they're going to go back to narco violence, femicides, racism, and they're going to say, well, yeah, Descartes was very interesting, but how do I use that for my lived experience? So there's a desperate need for that type of philosophy, because if we just keep doing what we're doing, there's not going to be very many students that will go out of their way to find that Latin American philosopher, or whoever it might be that they relate to, and pursue philosophy till the end, because you get very tired doing that. So that's why, me as a gatekeeper, I no longer want to do that. I want to open it up and say, look at everything we could be doing with philosophy. And I feel like that's been my position so far.
I know that you've done a lot of work in thinking about the teaching of philosophy, right? And you've created an open source textbook for the teaching of philosophy. Where would you like your work to go in the next few years in these kinds of ways, right? So you've been talking about opening the doors of philosophy. How do you see yourself continuing to do this kind of work for the kinds of students that we are talking about?
I recently convinced my college to approve a course called Academic Cooperative, and it's a philosophy course. And it's a course in which we have practical hands-on experience in the application of philosophy. So I've built this curriculum in which students will learn theories, but they'll also engage in philosophical praxis, and they'll get to experience the many fields in which we find philosophy. So a lot of people don't realize that philosophy is in the local, state, federal government, healthcare, business, social work, nonprofits, etc. So I built that course. It's already there. It's part of our catalog. I'm excited to teach it because with this pandemic, it's not so simple for me to have students practice philosophy hands-on like we've been doing in the club. So I'm excited to be able to teach that when we go back and we're able to navigate our community like we used to. I also created a philosophy resource corner, which is a small space outside of my office, and it has a lot of free philosophy books and movies and handouts on movie recommendations and book recommendations. And I would want to see that grow, because you'd be surprised at how many students that are not in a philosophy class that stop by and say, oh, this is cool, can I take this? And then they read it and then they come back. So I would want to expand that. I'm doing a lot of research on philosophical pedagogy and philosophical praxis. So I want to expand that more as a field. I'm trying to combine education and philosophy and just make my own hybrid and be able to convince educators that we need philosophy at all times, and philosophers that we're educators and we need to acknowledge the pedagogical component of being philosophers. So I'm working a lot on that. And then I also want to still be active in journalism. I feel like it's a privilege to be able to write or publish or be part of podcasts like these, in which you're able to express your ideas and inform other people. So those are the projects that I have. If I was dreaming big, I would want to have a center for border philosophy down the line, where we could see all the unique features of the border and have scholars and have like a sort of academy. And I think that would be very interesting.
So what are the kinds of, you mentioned some of these, but what would a center of border philosophy think about? What would its prime mission be to try to accomplish?
It would focus precisely on the phenomena that is unique of the border. Like, how do we make sense of femicides and narco violence and contested identities and translanguaging and all of these things that we've been told you can't speak two languages. You have to pick one side. Are you American or are you Mexican? There's a lot of unique issues that I feel like we could be creating more philosophical work on. And I feel like we could be teaching all these forgotten scholars, you know, that are not just coming in as a handout in our classes, but, you know, like preparing students. I mean, we have border studies, we have uh, curriculum that's dedicated to just border studies, but it tends to be not as philosophical as it
Mhm.
could be. So I would want to see that down the line.
Good. Well, Manuela Gomez, I want to thank you for your time and for sharing with us this perspective about what it might mean to think about philosophy more expansively, but particularly philosophy dedicated to thinking about the real life experience of the US-Mexico border, this terrain, this territory that I think many Americans probably don't know the history of very well or understand the important kinds of ties that area has had for the development both of the United States and in Mexico, and continues to have this ongoing legacy of pain and suffering, but also perhaps of human possibility that can come from this area. And so I want to thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for letting us know a little bit about what it might mean to think philosophically from that place.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I'm hopeful that this is only the beginning and we start expanding our philosophical parameters to include this as legitimate philosophical work.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing your time with us today. If you have any comments that you'd like to share with us about this idea of border philosophy or the idea of philosophy in service work, in activism work, go ahead and drop us a comment and leave us your thoughts. We'd love for you to also to subscribe to our channel and check out some of our other work. If you're interested in finding out more work about the work that the Anarres Project does, you can find us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can also find us at our website at anarresproject.org. Thank you once again. Thank you, Manuela.
Thank you.
We'll see you very soon. Thanks for everything.
Thank you.